real gospel in 10? What does that mean? Sometimes, because we live in a time of information overload, it's hard to sit down and listen to a presentation, a Bible study of an hour. And so in this series, I'm going to break down the gospel into bite-sized pieces. We're going to look at some Bible texts, some references from inspiration with very little commentary. And we're simply going to overview the subject of salvation. Our first subject that we're going to look at is the subject, what is sin? Now, why do we start with that? Because if we do not understand the problem, we will have a hard time understanding the solution. We need to know why we are lost, condemned sinners. And then we will be able to understand how the gospel solves that problem. So here is our first question. Do I sin because I am a condemned sinner, or am I a condemned sinner because I sin? The first question, do I sin because I am a condemned sinner, says that when we are born into this world, it's a fallen world, we have fallen parents, and we are born with a fallen nature. Therefore, we are condemned, lost sinners because of our birth state. And sure, then we lose our temper and we may be selfish, but those are just outgrowths of our real sin, which is being born with defective equipment, a fallen nature. The second question, am I a condemned sinner because I sin? Says, yes, we are born in a fallen world to fallen parents with a fallen nature. But we are not condemned, we are not lost because of an accident of birth. We are lost because we make choices to yield to the pulls of temptation. When we know what God's will is and we deliberately disobey, then we sin and become lost, condemned sinners. So that's the question that we need to answer. And we're just going to look briefly at some references from inspiration, what God is telling us about how this works. From John chapter 9, verse 41, Jesus said unto them, he's talking to the Pharisees, if ye were blind, ignorant, if they did not have any opportunity to know, if ye were blind, ye should have no sin. But now ye say, we see, we understand, we know what's going on, therefore your sin remaineth. So the first point, Jesus says that if there is no awareness of what God is saying to us, there is no sin. But when we understand what God is saying to us and deliberately disobey, then our sin remains. From James chapter 4, verse 17, therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. Pretty simple, pretty plain. To the one who knows what's right and what's wrong and does not obey, to him it is sin. From James 1, 14 and 15, perhaps the clearest text on temptation in the Bible. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. So, temptation is being pulled by our own lust. That means the pulls of our fallen nature. We're pulled by our fallen nature to do wrong. We're actually enticed. But that's not sin. That's temptation to sin. The way that it turns into sin is when it is conceived, like in the birth state. And we'll find out exactly what that means with another statement a little later. But sin is a yielding to temptation. It is not the temptation. From Ezekiel 18, verse 20, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. So again from the Old Testament, the soul that sins bears guilt and responsibility, not sons for fathers or fathers for sons. From Patriarchs and Prophets, page 306. It is inevitable that children should suffer from the consequences of parental wrongdoing, but they are not punished for the parents' guilt, except as they participate in their sins. So yes, children do suffer as a result of parent sins. And remember, Adam and Eve are our parents in the big picture. But children are not punished for their parents' sins unless they agree to participate in those sins. From Gospel Workers 162, as light comes, the life and character of men must change correspondingly to be in harmony with it. Sins that were once sins of ignorance, because of the blindness of the mind, can no more be indulged in without incurring guilt. Please notice that phrase, as the light comes. What is a sin of ignorance? When we cannot know, there is no opportunity for us to know what the will of God is. But when the light comes, and when we reject it, then we incur guilt. That's why babies simply cannot be sinners, because there is no light available for them to reject. From Testimonies, Volume 5, page 177. An impure thought tolerated, an unholy desire cherished, and the soul is contaminated, its integrity compromised. Temptation, however strong, is never an excuse for sin. He knows how strong are the inclinations of the natural heart, and He will help in every time of temptation. So notice how that fits with what we read in James chapter 1. The impure thought, the unholy desire, is not sin, it is temptation to sin. We are drawn by these out of our fallen nature. It is when we cherish that thought, when we tolerate that thought, that sin enters the picture. That's the conceiving that James 1 talks about, that we conceive something is born, which is sin. And so temptation and sin must be carefully distinguished, or we will run into serious problems in understanding the gospel. Testimonies, Volume 1, page 116. Said the angel, if light comes, and that light is set aside or rejected, then comes condemnation and the frown of God. But before the light comes, there is no sin, for there is no light for them to reject. This may be the simplest and clearest explanation I've ever read. If the light comes and is rejected, then we are under condemnation. But before the light comes, there is no sin. I really wonder how the English language could be any clearer on the subject of sin. So what are the consequences of believing one or the other of these two views? If we believe that we're born sinners because of faulty equipment, a fallen nature, then Jesus could not be born with our fallen nature, or that would make him a sinner too. And he could not be tempted from within as we are tempted from within. The gospel then must be justification, forgiveness alone, because we'll never be able to totally overcome sin as long as we live. And that means that we will be sinning in some way, even if by nature alone, until Jesus comes. We will never be free of sin in this life. However, if we believe that sin is always a choice that we make to reject God's will, then Jesus can be born with our nature and be tempted in all points like we are, from within as well as from without. The gospel is both justification, forgiveness, and sanctification, power to live above sin without sinning, and God will have a people before the end of time who will have rejected sin completely and will live lives of holy, sinless experience before Jesus comes. Those are the consequences of believing one or the other of these two views. Well, that's our study of what is sin in 10. That's way too brief. If you want to study this a little more in depth, I urge you to go back to the YouTube channel that you are on right now and look up Face to Face with the Real Gospel, Part 2, What is Sin? And listen to that presentation, watch that presentation. It is much more in-depth and covers more than I'm covering right now. And remember, we're just started. Our next subject, How Did Christ Live?, is the important remedy to the problem that we are all sinners under condemnation and lost. Our only remedy is in Jesus Christ. Stay tuned. If you have found this study helpful, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, where you will find more studies on various subjects.